At my pregnant daughter-in-law's gender reveal, I overheard her say something she clearly didn't expect me to hear. "I'm definitely getting a DNA test." She said it more than once. My son was across the park loading things into their car, and ever since that moment, I haven't been able to decide whether telling him could protect him from the biggest lie of his life or destroy what little relationship I still have with him over a conversation I may have completely misunderstood. My son is 28 years old. When he was little, we were incredibly close. He told me everything. If something happened at school, I knew about it. If he was excited, scared, embarrassed, or angry, I usually knew. For years, I felt like I understood him better than anyone. Then his father died, and something changed. Not overnight, but slowly. Grief changed both of us. I became more protective, he became more private. By the time he was a teenager, the little boy who used to tell me everything had started shutting doors. And the harder I tried to stay close to him, the more he seemed to need distance from me. We never completely lost our relationship. He still called, we still saw each other, we still loved each other, but it was different. Once he became an adult, I had to accept that I was no longer one of the first people he told things to, and whenever he entered a serious relationship, he pulled back even more. I'm telling you all of this because it explains why I didn't immediately say something after what I heard. It also explains why this whole situation scares me so much. Last Christmas, I went to see my son. That was when I really met the woman who was now his wife. I knew he was seeing someone. I just didn't realize how serious the relationship had become. I didn't even know they were living together. That hurt a little. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But he was 28. I reminded myself that I wasn't entitled to every detail of his adult life simply because I'm his mother. Then, maybe a week or so later, he told me she was pregnant. That was another shock. Suddenly, the woman I had barely begun getting to know was carrying my first grandchild. This was not how I had imagined becoming a grandmother, but very quickly I realized I had a choice. I could make everything about what my son hadn't told me, or I could accept the situation and try to build a relationship with the woman who was about to become part of our family permanently. I chose the second option. I wanted to know her better. I wanted her to feel comfortable around me. Most importantly, I wanted to be part of my grandchild's life. So I invited the two of them to lunch. That was when they told me something else. They were getting married very soon. Another major announcement, another part of my son's life that seemed to have happened before I even knew there was a story. But again, I swallowed whatever feelings I had. I went to the wedding. It was small, outside in a park, and somehow, of all things, we had snow in Florida that day. So there we were, standing outside in the cold watching my son get married. It wasn't the wedding I had imagined for him, but it wasn't my wedding. He looked happy, she looked happy, and I decided that was what mattered. After that, things were mostly fine. Then came the gender reveal in April. That is where everything changed for me. The party itself seemed normal. Family, friends, people eating, laughing, talking about the baby. Eventually, we learned they were having a girl, my first granddaughter. I remember looking around and thinking that maybe this was going to be good for all of us. Maybe the baby would create a reason for us to become closer. Maybe I would finally get to know my daughter-in-law properly. Maybe my son and I would find some version of the relationship we used to have. I wasn't expecting anything terrible to happen. Toward the end of the party, people started packing things up. My son was walking back and forth to their car, loading everything they had brought. His wife was talking to her stepmother. I was nearby. I didn't intentionally listening to them. I didn't even hear what the stepmother asked. I only heard my daughter-in-law's answer. "I'm definitely getting a DNA test done." I looked up. For a second, I wondered if I had misunderstood her. Then she said it again. "Yep, I'm getting the DNA test done." And then again, "I'm definitely getting it." I just sat there, frozen. Because what exactly am I supposed to think when my pregnant daughter-in-law starts talking about getting a DNA test while my son is away from the conversation? A DNA test for what? For the baby? For someone else in the family? Was there some kind of medical reason? Was she talking about one of those ancestry tests? Did my son already know? Was there some completely normal explanation that would make me feel ridiculous for even worrying? I had no idea. That was the problem. I heard the answer. I didn't hear the question. And without the question, I didn't have the context. All I had were those words. I'm definitely getting a DNA test. Then my son came back. He sat down next to her, and the atmosphere changed. At least that's how it felt to me. My daughter-in-law looked surprised that he was suddenly there. Then she turned around and saw me. I was staring directly at her. I couldn't help it. Her stepmother immediately changed the subject. She started asking my son whether he was excited about having a daughter. He said yes, and I sat there trying desperately not to react. My son noticed. Of course he did. Whatever distance exists between us now, he still knows my face. He came over and asked if I was okay. I already hadn't been feeling great that day, so I used that as an excuse. I told him I wasn't feeling well. I said I thought I should go home. I gathered the things I had brought. My older son came with me, and we left. I didn't say anything. Not to my son, not to his wife, not to anyone. And even now, part of me wonders whether that was my first mistake. Because the DNA comment was already enough to keep me awake, but somehow it wasn't even the only thing that worried me that day. My daughter-in-law was vaping during the pregnancy. Other people around her were smoking cigarettes, and later I overheard members of the group talking about plans involving marijuana after the party. From the conversation, it sounded like she planned to go with them. I left before any of that happened, so I want to be very clear. I did not see her use marijuana. I am not going to say she did something I didn't personally witness. I only know what I heard. But she was pregnant. I had already watched her vaping, and between that and the DNA conversation, I left the gender reveal feeling like I had suddenly discovered a side of my son's life that I knew absolutely nothing about. On the drive home, I kept replaying everything. The DNA test, her expression when my son sat down, her stepmother changing the subject, the vaping, the conversation about what they planned to do afterward. And then another thought started bothering me. Maybe I was already predisposed to see the worst. Because if I'm being completely honest, I had concerns about their relationship before the gender reveal. When they got together, my daughter-in-law stopped working. She also stopped going to school. My son became the main person financially supporting the household. At one point, her mother and several of her siblings was staying there too. She has a very large family, and from what I understood, my son was the only person in that house consistently working. That bothered me. I started wondering whether he was being taken advantage of. But this is where I have to check myself, because mothers say things like that all the time. She's using my son. She changed him. He was never like this before her. Sometimes mothers are right, and sometimes we refuse to accept that our sons are grown men making choices we would not make ourselves. My son is 28. He chose to live with her. He chose to marry her. He chose to support that household. Maybe he knows everything I think he doesn't know. Maybe he is perfectly happy. Maybe I'm looking at their relationship through the eyes of a mother who already feels excluded from her son's life. That possibility matters to me because I don't want to become that mother-in-law, the one who decides every problem in her son's marriage proves she was right about his wife, the one who creates drama because she can't accept that her adult son has another woman at the center of his life now. I don't want that. But I also cannot erase what I heard. I'm definitely getting a DNA test. I keep coming back to that sentence. Since the gender reveal, I've tried to find a way to speak to my son privately. That has been surprisingly difficult. I don't mean I want to drag him into a room and demand that he leave his wife. I just want 10 minutes alone with him. At one point, I asked him if he would go with me to visit my mother. She lives in a nursing home. I told him I hadn't been feeling well and thought it would be better if he came with me in case something happened. He never really responded to the invitation. Other times I've gone by and he's come outside to speak to me. Then his wife comes out too. If we're talking, she'll start another conversation with him. The private moment disappears. I don't know whether she does that intentionally. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe they're simply the kind of married couple who are always together. But I cannot seem to get my son alone. And every time I fail, I start wondering whether I'm supposed to say it in front of both of them. Maybe that would actually be more honest. Maybe I should look directly at her and say, I heard something at the gender reveal, and I need to understand what you meant. But then I imagine what happens next. She gets angry. My son gets defensive. Suddenly, instead of giving him information, I'm confronting his pregnant wife in front of him. And because our relationship is already delicate, he might immediately assume the worst about my intentions. So I keep rehearsing another version of the conversation, the one I would have if I could finally get him alone. I would say, I heard something at the party that worries me. I don't know what it means, I don't know the context, and I may have misunderstood it, but I think you deserve to know exactly what I heard. That's it. No accusation, no theory, no, your wife cheated on you, no, that baby isn't yours, no, she's taking advantage of you. Because I don't know any of those things. All I would tell him is what happened. His wife said she was definitely getting a DNA test several times. Then I would let him decide what that information means. When I say it out loud to myself, that seems reasonable, almost obvious. He's my son. Why wouldn't I tell him? But then the fear starts. Because he isn't the little boy who used to tell me everything anymore. He's a grown man who has spent years becoming more distant from me. And maybe I need to accept something painful. Maybe I think our relationship is closer than he does. He didn't tell me he was living with this woman. I barely had time to process the pregnancy before I learned they were getting married. I've struggled just to get 10 minutes along with him. Behavior says things people don't always say out loud. And maybe his behavior has been saying, Mom, I don't want you this involved in my life. What happens if I ignore that? What if I tell him what I heard, he confronts his wife, and there's a perfectly innocent explanation? What if the DNA test has nothing to do with paternity? Maybe my son already knows exactly what she meant. Then what? I become the mother who took one overheard sentence and nearly blew up her son's marriage. And given the history between us, I don't know if he would forgive me. Worse, I don't know if he would let me stay involved in their lives. There's a baby coming, my first granddaughter, and I hate admitting this, but I'm terrified that saying the wrong thing could cost me the chance to know her. I don't want that fear to control me. I don't want to keep quiet simply because I want access to a grandchild. That would be selfish. But pretending the fear doesn't exist would also be dishonest. I lost my husband. Then, slowly, I lost the closeness I once had with my son. I don't want to lose him completely. And I don't want to lose this baby before she is even born. But then I imagine the other possibility. I say nothing. The baby is born, months pass, maybe years. Then one day my son discovers that there really was a reason his wife was talking about a DNA test. Maybe the child isn't biologically his. Maybe there was another man. Maybe there is some truth I cannot even imagine right now. And then he finds out that his mother was sitting a few feet away when his wife talked about getting that test, and I never told him. What happens then? What do I say? I didn't want you to be angry with me? I was afraid you would choose her over me? I was scared you wouldn't let me see the baby? Would any of those explanations matter?
Because if I were him, I think I would feel betrayed, maybe even more betrayed because I was his mother. And that is the part I cannot get past. Keeping quiet feels safer right now, but staying silent is still a choice. Every day I don't tell him, I am choosing not to tell him. And if he eventually learns that I knew something important and said nothing, then I may lose him anyway. That is what makes this so difficult. I'm afraid speaking will destroy our relationship, and I'm afraid silence will destroy it later. I keep thinking that if I can just get him alone, I'll know what to do. I'll look at him. I'll say the sentence I've practiced 100 times. I don't know what it means. I don't know the context. I may have misunderstood it, but I think you deserve to know exactly what I heard. And then I'll tell him. At least that's what I tell myself I'm going to do. But every time I imagine actually saying the words, I see the little boy who used to trust me with everything. Then I see the grown man who barely tells me anything now. And I wonder whether this conversation would finally bring us back to honesty or be the thing that pushes him out of my life for good. If I speak, I could lose him. If I stay silent and he learns the truth later, I could lose him anyway. And right now, I still don't know which risk I'm willing to take. Update. I finally told my son what I heard at the gender reveal. And somehow the conversation went worse than almost every scenario I had imagined. For 2 days after the party, I barely slept. I went to work, but I couldn't concentrate. I would read the same email 3 times and still have no idea what it said. At night, I would lie in bed replaying that conversation. I'm definitely getting a DNA test. Over and over. Every time I convinced myself there had to be an innocent explanation, I remembered my daughter-in-law's expression when my son came back. Then I told myself I was reading too much into it. Then I remembered her stepmother immediately changing the subject. It was making me crazy. My older son knew something was wrong because he had left the gender reveal with me. At first, I didn't want to tell him. I already felt guilty enough carrying information that might not mean what I thought it meant. The last thing I wanted was to turn this into family gossip. But eventually, he pushed me. He asked why I had been so upset when we left. So I told him everything, exactly what I heard, nothing more. His reaction was immediate. "You have to tell him." I said I wasn't sure. He looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Mom, if his wife is talking about a DNA test and he doesn't know about it, you cannot keep that from him." I told him that we didn't know what the test was for. Maybe it had nothing to do with paternity. Maybe his brother already knew. Maybe I misunderstood the entire conversation. My older son said, "Then let him tell you that." I still hesitated. That was when he became angry with me. "If you don't tell him, I will." I told him absolutely not. This wasn't his marriage either. He said, "I'm not going to let everyone make a fool out of my brother while he's the last person in the room to know it." That sentence hit me hard because that was exactly what I was afraid of. Not necessarily that she had cheated, I still didn't know that. But what if everyone around my son knew something he didn't? Her stepmother, her family, maybe her friends, and now me. What if my silence made me one more person protecting everyone except him? That night, I made my decision. I was going to tell him, but I was going to do it carefully. No accusations, no theories, no comments about his wife not working, nothing about my concerns over the pregnancy, nothing about whether I thought he was being taken advantage of. Just the sentence I had practiced over and over. The next morning, I texted him, "I need 10 minutes alone with you. I'm not asking you for anything, and I'm not trying to interfere in your marriage. I just need to tell you something I personally heard." He didn't answer for several hours. When he finally did, he asked, "What is this about?" I said I would rather tell you in person. He called me immediately. He sounded irritated before I had even explained anything. "Mom, what happened now?" That hurt. Not because he was angry, because of the word now. Like problems coming from me were expected. I told him I wasn't going to discuss it over the phone. Finally, he agreed to come by after work the following evening, alone. For the first time since the gender reveal, I thought maybe I could breathe. Then he arrived, and the moment I saw his face, all that confidence disappeared. He didn't sit down at first. He stayed near the door and said, "Okay, what was so important?" I asked him to sit. He did, but he looked impatient, so I said exactly what I had promised myself I would say. "I heard something at the party that worries me. I don't know what it means, I don't know the context, and I may have misunderstood it, but I think you deserve to know exactly what I heard." His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. I continued, "When you were loading the car, Your wife was talking to her stepmother. He stared at me. I didn't hear what her stepmother asked her, but I heard your wife say she was definitely getting a DNA test. He said nothing. So I added, she said it several times. Still nothing. I expected shock, confusion, maybe disbelief. Instead, his face hardened. Then he asked, were you listening to their conversation? I honestly couldn't believe that was his first question. No, I was sitting right there. I heard her answer. So you heard one sentence? Yes. Without knowing what they were talking about? I already told you that. He stood up, and then he became angry, not at his wife, at me. This is exactly why I don't tell you things. I felt like someone had slapped me. I asked him what that was supposed to mean. He said, you hear one thing and immediately decide there's a problem you need to fix. I told him I hadn't decided anything. That was the whole reason I had waited. I hadn't confronted his wife. I hadn't called anyone. I hadn't accused her of cheating. I had spent 2 sleepless nights trying to decide whether I even had the right to tell him. He said, you always have a reason. I asked, a reason for what? To get involved. Then he started bringing up things I hadn't expected. He said I had always struggled to let him make his own decisions, that after his father died, I became overprotective, that when he was a teenager, I constantly wanted to know where he was, who he was with, what he was doing. I told him, you were a teenager. Your father had just died. He said, I know, and I know you were scared, but I'm not 16 anymore. I reminded him that I literally started the conversation by saying I might have misunderstood what I heard. That wasn't good enough. He told me his wife had already noticed my reaction at the gender reveal. Apparently, after I left, she told him I had been staring at her strangely. She told him I'd suddenly become quiet and then left, and she had asked him whether I had a problem with her. That surprised me. I asked, what did you tell her? He said, I told her you always have opinions. I cannot explain how much that hurt. Maybe because part of me knew there was some truth behind it. I do have opinions. I worry. I ask questions. I probably did become too protective after losing my husband. Maybe sometimes my son experienced my fear as control. But this wasn't about whether I liked his wife. At least I didn't think it was. So I said, if you think I'm interfering, fine. Be angry with me, but I would rather have you angry because I told you something than someday find out you needed to know and I stayed quiet. He laughed. Not because anything was funny. It was that frustrated little laugh people make when they've decided the conversation is pointless. Then he said, you really think I don't know what's happening in my own marriage? I stopped. Something about the way he said it felt different. So I asked, what does that mean? He shook his head. It means exactly what I said. Do you know why she wants a DNA test? He didn't answer. I asked again, does this have something to do with the baby? He told me, I am not discussing my marriage with you. I said, I'm not asking for details. I just need to know whether I told you something you already knew. He walked toward the door. I followed him. I told him whether he liked it or not, I loved him, that I had not spent 2 sleepless nights trying to destroy his marriage. I had been terrified of destroying my relationship with him. He turned around and said, then stop trying to manage my life. I almost cried right there. I asked him if telling him exactly what I heard really counted as managing his life. He said, you don't know where the line is anymore. Then he said something that scared me more than his anger. If you keep treating my wife like she's some kind of threat, you're going to make things very difficult when the baby gets here. There it was, the fear I had been trying not to name, my granddaughter. I asked, are you saying you wouldn't let me see the baby because I told you something I heard? He said, I am saying I'm going to protect my family. I didn't know whether he meant from drama, from me, or from something else entirely. He opened the door, and I asked one last time, do you already know about the DNA test? He stood there for a few seconds with his back to me. Then he said, the DNA test is not news to me.
and walked out. I just stood there because for 2 days, my biggest fear had been that my son was being deceived and I was helping keep him in the dark. But he wasn't in the dark, at least not about the test. He knew, which should have made me feel better. It didn't, because now I had a completely different question. Why would my pregnant daughter-in-law be discussing a DNA test with her stepmother? Why would my son already know about it? And why did telling him what I heard make him so angry? My older son called me later that night. I told him everything. For once, even he didn't immediately know what to say. Then he asked me something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. Mom, did he ever actually say the baby is his? No, he didn't. Final update. My son knew about the DNA test because his wife had already told him there was another possible father. That was the part he refused to tell me. But it wasn't even the hardest thing I learned about their marriage. After he left my house, we didn't speak for almost a week. I didn't call, I didn't text. For once, I decided to respect exactly what he had asked for: distance. My older son was furious. He kept saying his brother had no right to speak to me the way he had. I told him to leave it alone. The last thing this family needed was one brother confronting the other because of something I had started. Besides, there was one sentence I couldn't get out of my head. The DNA test is not news to me. My son knew. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. It made everything more confusing. Why would a married man expecting his first child already know that his pregnant wife planned to get a DNA test? And why couldn't he simply tell me there was an innocent explanation? I started thinking maybe the answer was obvious. Maybe the explanation wasn't innocent. 6 days later, my son called me. It was after 11 at night. The first thing he said was, "Are you alone?" I said yes. Then there was silence. Finally, he said, "You wanted to know about the DNA test. I'll tell you, but after this, I need you to understand that this is my life." I told him I understood. I don't think either of us believed that completely. Then he told me the truth. There was another man. My daughter-in-law had been involved with him around the time she became pregnant. According to my son, their relationship had already been falling apart. They fought constantly. They had briefly separated. Then they started trying to reconcile. And during that messy period, after they had already begun trying to rebuild the relationship, she slept with another man, close enough to the time the baby was conceived that she couldn't be absolutely certain who the biological father was. I didn't say anything. Part of me had prepared for exactly that answer, but hearing my son actually say it made it real. Then he said, "Before you say anything, I knew before I married her." That shocked me almost more than the affair. "You knew?" "Yes." "Before the wedding?" "Yes." "And you married her anyway?" His voice changed immediately. There was that defensiveness again. "This is why I didn't want to tell you." I told him I wasn't judging him. That was probably a lie. Of course I was judging. I'm his mother. I had spent days imagining my son as some innocent husband being deceived behind his back. Now I was finding out that he had walked into his own wedding knowing there was a possibility the baby wasn't biologically his. I asked the question I think almost any mother would ask. Why? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I wasn't innocent either." And suddenly the story became something completely different. He had cheated too. Earlier in their relationship, he had been involved with another woman. His wife found out. They nearly ended things. Then they decided to stay together. According to him, they spent months trying to rebuild trust, except they never really rebuilt it. They just kept going. More arguments, more accusations, more checking each other's phones, more threatening to leave, more apologies, more getting back together. Then his wife became involved with the other man. My son said they had both done things they were ashamed of, and when she became pregnant, instead of ending the relationship, they decided the baby would be their reason to start over. I actually asked him, "You decided to fix a relationship with a baby?" He snapped, "That's not what I said." But I think in some ways, that was exactly what he was saying. The pregnancy became a reset button. They moved forward. They got married. They told themselves whatever happened before the wedding belonged to the past. There was just one problem. Nobody knew for certain who had fathered the baby. That was the DNA test. It had always been part of the plan. They were going to test the baby after she was born. They had simply agreed not to tell either family, especially me. That last part hurt. I asked, "Why especially me?" He said, "Because you would do exactly what you're doing right now." What am I doing? Trying to decide whether my marriage should exist? I told him I wasn't trying to decide anything for him. Then I asked, "If the baby isn't yours, what are you going to do?" He didn't answer. I asked again. Finally, he said, "I don't know." That was the first moment in the entire conversation when he stopped sounding angry. He just sounded tired. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. "I know what it feels like to grow up without a father." I stopped breathing for a second. Of course he knew. He had lost his father as a teenager. I had spent all this time thinking about how losing my husband changed my relationship with my son. I hadn't really considered how much it might still be shaping the decisions he was making as a grown man. He said, "If that baby comes into this world and I'm the only father she knows, I don't know if I can just walk away because of a piece of paper." I told him, "That isn't the same as what happened to you." "I know. Your father died. He didn't choose to leave you." "I know, Mom." But there was something in his voice that told me the distinction didn't matter as much to him as it did to me. Maybe somewhere inside him, a child without a father was still simply a child without a father. Then the conversation got even harder, because once my son started talking, things came out that had nothing to do with DNA. He admitted their marriage was not nearly as stable as I thought. They fought a lot, sometimes about money, sometimes about trust, sometimes about her family, sometimes about my family, sometimes about the other people they had both been involved with. There had been nights when one of them packed a bag and threatened to leave. Then the next morning, they would apologize and act as if nothing had happened. She checked his phone, he checked hers. She accused him of still talking to the woman he had cheated with. He accused her of hiding messages from the possible biological father. During some of their worst arguments, she had thrown the paternity question in his face. "You don't even know if this baby is yours." And according to him, he had said cruel things back. I asked, "Why are you two married?" He became angry again. Then he said, "Because we love each other." I didn't answer. Maybe they do. I'm sure in their own way they probably do. But listening to him describe their relationship, I kept thinking that love was doing an incredible amount of work in that sentence. Then I asked about something else, the gender reveal, the vaping, the conversation I overheard afterward about marijuana. His response told me immediately that this wasn't new information either. He knew. He said marijuana had been part of their social life before the pregnancy, his too. He admitted there had been a few occasions early in the pregnancy when she continued using it after they already knew she was pregnant. He insisted she had stopped. I asked about the vaping. He sighed. "She's working on it." I said, "She's pregnant." "I know that." "Then why are you saying she's working on it like we're talking about biting her fingernails?" He got angry. I could hear that wall coming back up, so I stopped. Because something had become very clear to me.
My son did not need me to discover that his life was chaotic. He knew. He wasn't being blindly manipulated while everyone around him laughed behind his back. He was participating in this life, making decisions inside it, defending it, sometimes contributing to the chaos himself. That was difficult for me to accept. Maybe more difficult than believing his wife was simply taking advantage of him. Because if she were the only problem, I could blame her. I could tell myself that my son was still the same boy I had raised, and some woman had simply pulled him into a terrible situation. But that wasn't the truth. My son was 28 years old. He had cheated. He had forgiven cheating. He had stayed. He had married her knowing the baby might not be his. He had participated in a lifestyle I didn't understand. He had hidden all of it from me, and he made those choices himself. For the first time since this began, I started asking myself a different question. How well do mothers really know their sons once those little boys become grown men? We remember everything about the children they were. I remember what food he refused to eat when he was 6. I remember the first time another child bullied him. I remember the girl who broke his heart in high school. I remember sitting beside him after his father died because he refused to cry in front of anyone else. I remember a little boy who once trusted me with absolutely everything. And because I remember all of that, some part of me assumed I still knew him. But did I? I knew my son. Did I know the man? Apparently, there were entire years of his life happening behind doors I had never been invited through. A serious relationship, living together, infidelity, reconciliation, another infidelity, a pregnancy with uncertain paternity, a rushed wedding, arguments, substance use, financial problems. All of it existed before I even understood what kind of relationship he was in. Maybe I wasn't only discovering secrets about my daughter-in-law. Maybe I was discovering how little I knew about the adult my own child had become. And that has been one of the hardest things to accept. After that conversation, things between my son and me were strange, not completely broken, but definitely not repaired. He told me he regretted the way he spoke to me when I first confronted him. I apologized for some things too. I told him I probably had become too involved in his life after his father died. Fear can look a lot like control when you're the person on the receiving end of it. But I also told him I did not regret telling him what I heard. He said, I know. That was the closest thing either of us gave the other to admitting we might both have been right about something. Over the next few months, we spoke occasionally, mostly about ordinary things: work, my mother in the nursing home, how his wife was feeling. I stopped asking about the DNA test. I decided that if he wanted me to know, he would tell me. Then the baby came, my granddaughter. He sent me a photograph before he called, just her little face wrapped in a hospital blanket. For a few seconds, every ugly thing surrounding this situation disappeared. I didn't care about DNA. I didn't care about arguments. I didn't care who had cheated on whom. There was just this tiny baby, and my son saying, "She's here." I cried. He let me visit. His wife was polite, but distant. I was polite too. Nobody discussed the gender reveal. Nobody discussed our confrontation. Nobody discussed the other man. I held that baby for maybe 15 minutes. She slept almost the entire time. And I remember looking down at her and thinking how unfair it was that so many adults had already complicated a life that had barely begun. She hadn't cheated on anyone. She hadn't lied. She hadn't made any of these decisions. She was just a baby. A few days after they came home from the hospital, my son called me. He said, "We did the test." I knew immediately what he meant. The paternity test. I asked, "And?" "We don't have the results yet." I didn't ask anything else. Maybe because I was afraid. Maybe because at that point I wasn't even sure what result I was hoping for. If the baby is his, that doesn't suddenly make their marriage healthy. It doesn't erase the affairs. It doesn't erase the lies. It doesn't erase the substance use during the pregnancy. It doesn't erase the disrespect they've shown each other. And if the baby isn't his, I have absolutely no idea what my son will do. He once told me he didn't know if he could walk away from a child simply because they didn't share DNA, but saying that before the baby is born is one thing. Holding her is another. Getting a laboratory result saying another man fathered the child your wife just gave birth to is something else entirely. Maybe he stays. Maybe he leaves. Maybe the biological father wants to be involved. Maybe he doesn't. There are suddenly more lives connected to one result than I can even count. When this began, I believed the biggest question was whether I should interfere in my adult son's marriage. I thought I was deciding whether to protect him from something he didn't know. I was wrong. He knew far more than I did. And maybe the hardest part of raising children isn't letting them grow up. Maybe it's realizing that one day they become people you love completely, but no longer fully know. The DNA results are supposed to come soon. My son promised he would tell me when he knows. So now I'm waiting to find out whether that little girl is biologically his. But strangely, I'm no longer sure that's the most frightening answer. Because regardless of whose daughter she is, my son still has to decide what kind of marriage he is trying to save. And I'm still trying to understand the man my little boy became. For now, none of us knows what the test is going to say, and that is where this story ends, at least for now.